The principle of getting what I want out of my life is
Eddie Wilson.
Eddie Wilson.
Eddie Wilson.
Eddie Wilson is a businessman who is known as the king of exits. He's co-founder of the Aspirator Tour, has owned well over 100 companies, and has successfully exited 90 businesses. Eddie is involved globally in humanitarian work through impactothers.com and leads across all his projects with a guiding sense of purpose. What would you say has been the lesson that's taken you the longest to learn?
I think people look at it and they go, man, Eddie must be a deal junkie because he's sold all these companies. I might be, but it really comes down to I've got this massive purpose that's driving me. And I think that's what creates the resilience.
What have you been learning about your own highs and lows?
And I found this moment of gratitude on the way back in after one of the worst days of my business career.
The Icon's a show where we learn life lessons from those who may shape the icon in each of us. And today I'm excited to learn what it takes to build and exit successful businesses while also giving back.
It was very much an introspective moment. I want to make sure that this doesn't just serve me. Exchanging your time for the things that matter most and are the most valuable to you often brings the wealth that you ultimately want. The fear of loss is really not something we should fear. Sometimes in loss, it brings us our greatest opportunity. In any low, if you can find gratitude in the moment, it becomes a catalyst for your greatest lessons in life.
Eddie Wilson, welcome to the Icons by Motiversity.
Thanks, Tyler. I really appreciate the opportunity to be on the show.
Yeah, it's been fascinating learning a bit about your background. Even just that line of exiting 90 businesses, it's hard to even understand how that's possible. Certainly speaks to a really successful business system. I'm also fascinated by the life system that sits underneath that. Let's start with life first. What have you been learning about life success because of your business success?
Life success, to go back just a step, I have amazing parents, and I was super fortunate to grow up in an environment where my father was an entrepreneur, but also my mother was an entrepreneur. Both of them started businesses. Both of them ran successful businesses. And I learned so much about just the life operating system through them that I was super fortunate. I feel like I had a jump start where a lot of people did not, and it wasn't really my college education or formal education anyway that led me to where I am. It was the life education, and really just some basic principles that were huge for me. Is I had a father who understood and had a great relationship with fear. He left his corporate job to try to pursue what was his dream. And I watched him do it. And sometimes he was successful. Sometimes we were extremely poor as a family, and sometimes we were wealthy. And I watched that. And he was also present in my life. And so I saw this great dad who also had the ups and downs of the entrepreneurial journey. And so for me, while he probably looks back on those periods of time and he probably says to himself, I never want to go back to those low moments. I look at those low moments and I think, what's the worst that can happen if I go all in? I end up spending time with my family. I end up having a good relationship with my kids, right? He really had a great relationship with fear and taught me and gave me a great gift. And that is to understand, what to truly fear, right? The fear of loss is really not something we should fear. Sometimes in loss, it brings us our greatest opportunity. The greatest times I ever had with my father was when we were at the lowest point financially, right? To me, it's just watching a person navigate that and experiencing that really helped me deal with fear. The second thing that he taught me is really ego is the enemy. My dad is a quiet leader who is not going to be an alpha, beat his chest. You're never going to find him on social media touting his wares. He was a guy who led from the back, who was never afraid of picking up the shovel himself. Who is quiet, who is a leader in his own right, very demonstrative, but in a very quiet sense. And his actions and his results always far outspoke his words or the volume of his voice. The thing I learned from my mother, though, was gratitude. And that, I had suffered quite a bit of loss in my younger life. I lost a sister, then later lost a brother. And my mom, just a very strong, an emotionally aware person, would constantly bring me back towards this point of gratitude. She would say, Eddie, tell me about, I would struggle with the loss of my sister. And she would say, Eddie, let's talk about your sister. Let's talk about your favorite day. Let's talk about the favorite toy she had. Let's talk about what was your favorite moment. And then she would help me rehearse gratitude, even in loss. And some of the greatest lessons I've ever learned in my life was to be afraid of the things that you should intentionally be afraid of. To remind myself constantly that ego actually is the enemy. Ego actually prevents me from getting where I want to go. And if I can find gratitude in the low moments, they become catalysts for massive growth.
Wow. I mean, thanks for sharing about your family life, but also just, some of the events that happened early in your life. I can imagine that's been pretty shaping for you. And, you started by saying, you learn these basic things. And what I find interesting is, more and more we meet with those who've had incredible success, it often does come back to basics. And I think that sometimes people who are listening or watching want this sophisticated answer, like want the next book that just told them something they've never heard before, as opposed to kind of just hearing something they've already heard, maybe a bit differently. And I think that's really powerful for you to kind of ground it in that way. And it, makes me think about your Aspire Tour, because, I've got a long time ago, I've got a background in events. I know that events can be hard, they're stressful, but you were already successful in business and you started this thing. And for those who don't know what it is, I mean, it's one of the biggest business tours in North America. Some of the speakers, I mean, the lineup is unreal. David Goggins, Shaq, Gary Vee. I mean, these are just some of the names that are going. But why did you start that tour?
Yeah. Multiple reasons. There was a business side of it, which was I have a private equity firm where we buy and sell companies, start companies. And my thesis on private equity is you build community, you understand the data in that community, and you serve them with the products and services. So people always ask me when I'm buying companies, what's your buy box? What type of company are you buying? And I'm like, whatever my community tells me they need. Or if I see a gap in the service of that community, I would rather have a controlled environment to offer a product or service with a group of people that I already know need it, rather than to try to find my way into a space that I have no entryway into. So the Aspire Tour is really about aggregating small businesses across America. The second thing is I saw a massive gap. And that is today, we have a lack of leadership nationally. And this isn't meant to be a political statement at all, but like nationally, we lack leadership. Right? Like we have kind of consensus leadership. We have very few people just standing up and saying, this is the right thing to do, so therefore I'm going to do it. Right? Like it's like, well, I'll do it if the masses say it's okay for me to do it, So we have a lack in leadership. We also have a lack in the educational system, right? Like we're not producing at the same level that we were in our educational system 40 or 50 years ago, right? Like we're not having the same successes come out of our educational system. And so there's a lack of education. There's a lack of context in the educational system. Those people that are typically teaching have never done. And sometimes we lack context in the teaching structure. And then we lack, thirdly, vulnerability. We lack just what this show is talking specifically about is like, what we lack is like we see, because we've moved from like the age of industry to the age of information, and now we're in the age of influence is what's being stated. It's like that we look at people on social media and we see the car, or we see the jet, or we see the house, and we think like, oh, what I have to do is just do what they did on social media to get those items. And we don't ever have context to those things. So the reason the Aspire Tour, I had the monetary reason for myself, but I saw the gap. And the gap was we have to bring real education with vulnerability and the ability and true leadership in topics that people don't want to talk about. And that was really the structure of Aspire. I didn't know if anybody would accept it. Like I thought, we'll try one event and see how it goes. And it kind of has taken the nation by storm in the last 14, 16 months. But one of the promise that we have our speakers make is if you're going to stand on our stage and you're Gary Vee, David Goggins, Shaq, Kevin O'Leary, whoever it is, Mark Cuban, you have to be very vulnerable with our listener, because what I don't want is one more rehearsed speech that they've already seen on YouTube or social media. I want to get into the weeds of like, but what was the struggle like? What did it actually take? What did you fear? What did you have to overcome? What were the steps? How long did it actually take? And the ones that we have back consistently are the ones that are the most vulnerable.
Interesting that's the Like that's the metric of success on stage. I mean, obviously, if you're on the stage, you're successful. So now you're looking for that ability to connect in a really authentic way with people. That's really interesting. And one of the things that struck me was when you were talking about community, because I think sometimes this is confusing for people. You were talking about, there is a give back component, but there's also a part that's going to come back to me. And there's a business component to this too. And sometimes we sometimes think it needs to be one or the other, but it feels like you've kind of found this mesh point between both. Does that feel like that's the way you've approached business from the start, or is this kind of a new approach that you've been building into?
It was learned for sure. And that is, again, I grew up in a home of a great father who would say things like this. Eddie, find a group of people to serve and you'll never lack for revenue. You'll never lack for opportunity. Serve them and serve them well, and they'll never leave you. Like I heard those things growing up, and so my belief is, and whether I've coined this phrase or I learned it somewhere along the way, I'm not sure, but I believe in what I call cause capitalism, right? Like capitalism in its right context is very serving of the general population, because what it says is may the best service or product delivered in the right way win, right? With the right price. And that part of capitalism is amazing, right? Because it at that point, it serves the consumer. I like adding the cause piece back to it. So I say I'm a cause capitalist. My businesses exist to make money, but my businesses should also have an altruistic look at serving the customer and having a greater reach than just the business itself. And so, when I talk about this community, it's not just about, can I build a community and monetize the community? It's about, can I actually serve the community? Will they stay with me for long periods of time? And can I take a portion of that and do something even greater with it? If I do earn revenue, or I earn the favor of the people and they're willing to go with me. And to me, that's where I think capitalism in its purest form does the greatest good.
And I'm guessing there's been some ups and downs along this path. You're talking about your dad's journey, which had, highs and lows, but also had this great family component that kind of was built almost independent of the highs and lows. What have you been learning about your own highs and lows?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the lesson of my mother, which is gratitude. My very first exit was an unintentional exit. I was just trying to source capital, and some corporate giants came in kind of behind the scenes, took advantage of me at a level that I didn't even know the game we were playing, and at the last hour, it was like, hey, by the way, this is about what's going to happen to you. And it cost me, it probably cost me in the long run, 20 to 30 million that I could have had personally. Like, it was a big, big lesson. And they gave me 24 hours to make a decision. It's very kind of them, and so I went home frustrated, mad, thinking about revenge. How do I get my lawyers? And I just realized I was outclassed. I was outplayed. I had no idea. I really had no business playing the game that they were playing, because I wasn't prepared. And so I'm driving back in the next day. I have to go in and sign some papers, mad and frustrated. And the words of my mother kind of like came back, like, in any low, if you can find gratitude in the moment, it becomes a catalyst for your greatest lessons in life. And I started thinking, I was like, this is interesting. I'm trying to get to a place of like positivity. Like, how do I actually see the benefit in what just happened to me, or what's currently happening to me? And it dawned on me, they were actually giving me what's in the business realm, like in this exiting companies, what was called 7 times multiple on my EBITDA, right? So like, let's just say my net revenue, they're giving me 7 times that. And it dawned on me, if I were to work the same amount of hours for the next 7 years doing the exact same thing, and I didn't see any increase or decrease, essentially what they're doing is giving me 7 years of my life back in this moment. Now, I might have wanted 10 or 20 years of my life back, but they're giving me 7. And I found this like moment of gratitude on the way back in after like one of the worst days of my business career, and thought, you know what? If I could live my life today as if I'd want to live it in 7 years with this revenue, what would my life look like? I started to like take that lesson of my mother and finding gratitude in the low moment and going, you know what? Like, I get 7 years of my life back. I get to go live today. Like, who gets that blessing in life, right? Like, and then it became the catalyst or the mantra of how I do business. how do I shrink down my time so that instead of living, trying to live 100 lifetimes, and dying with this expectation of giving back later, what if I could actually live 100 lifetimes today in this process of shrinking down time by selling something at a exponential multiple without having to go through the process, and then take that capital and go do something massive with it. And, in 2019, I sold 76 companies in 1 year for, about 1.27 billion. And that day, that year, as I sold those businesses, I got to go live, I got to begin living the life that I wanted to live, that would have taken me 20 or 30 years had I just operated those businesses that day, right? I got to go build orphanages and feeding centers and stuff all around the world. So that's what I'm learning in the highs and lows. It's like, it's the lesson that was already there that I'm just trying to speed up life's about iterations. It's about going through the same process and trying to speed up the learning lesson so that you don't have to go through the pain of it taking so long to sink in. Now I'm trying to watch the lows and go, okay, how do I find gratitude in the moment? So that I don't have to wait 24 hours or 48 hours or a year to suffer through that process to learn the lesson.
Wow. I mean, lots of our listeners will never build a business, exit a business, but I think all of them would find quite a bit of context in that idea of just like, this is a terrible day, and tomorrow I got to wake up and figure out what tomorrow looks like. And so what comes first for you with that idea of gratitude? Like, do you think find gratitude and then search for it? Or did the strategy kick in where it's like, okay, I mean, that's a pretty sophisticated principle of shrinking down time. What comes first for you when you're actually in that low moment?
I think the first thing is just, there are people that are more on the emotional scale versus the logical scale. I find myself to be on a much more logical scale and less emotion. So I often am not in touch with the emotions I feel. And so what I have to do is first identify that it's a low, because typically when you're a very logical person, you just kind of like set aside the emotion, which the emotion typically is like what shows you the valley. And so for me, it's about actually recognizing the emotion. Like, why this is a bad day. This day kind of sucked. Like, why was it bad? Like what did I dislike? And I think it's about the identification first. Then I think it's turning it to like, now this, the identification of the low, really what happens is there's a fork in the road. Any low, any valley you're in, every problem you go through, you either get to take a right turn, and that right turn is if you sit inside of the low emotional state, it becomes your identity, right? Like, so a person who suffers loss, I that day as I went through that loss, I could have said, you know what, I'm just the guy that gets taken advantage of by corporate America, like shaking my fist, like these guys, I can't believe they, it's like I could have created the identity. That's where a lot of people land, and they create a ceiling in their life, and it's like, my identity is my loss. It's the thing that I did poorly. It's who I am. Or you get to take that left turn once you identify, and that left turn is when gratitude kicks in, and it's like, and then gratitude for the lessons or the opportunities in that space allow massive growth. So it's like, you really go to this fork in the road in every low moment. It either becomes your identity or it becomes the catalyst. And so for me, it's that's the process, right? That's the strategy. Live in it, identify it, feel it, and then decide what relationship I want with it. Do I want this to be my identity, or do I actually want to find gratitude for every lesson, for every opportunity, and then allow it to be a catalyst for massive growth?
Wow. That idea of the fork in the road just feels so clear. I mean, obviously the identification of I am at a low, I am at a fork, but even just to lay it out that way, like, I could go this way and this defines me, or I could go this way and this is an accelerant, or it's a set of learning, or it's something that opens up the path. Do you find, because I think there's the resilient part which comes from the low, but there's the resilient part that can also come from the high, like, because it can also just be hard to stay at that pace, to do that thing. Like, you can be on the path of something being great, and it still requires a lot of resilience. Like, how have you managed that part in your life, that things are going well, but it doesn't overwhelm you, it doesn't lead you off track? How have you managed that?
I think that's where mission and purpose come in. If you're just playing for the immediate win, then it's this whole concept of as an entrepreneur, I'm either achievement based or I'm purpose based. Achievement is like the next mountaintop, the next success, the next win. And that's a big circular mess to be in, right? Because every mountaintop you climb, you get to it and you get about 3/4 of the way up and you realize like, oh wait, there's a bigger one over there, right? Like there's a bigger opportunity, there's something greater. And it becomes very cyclical. And so I think it's tough to be resilient unless you have a true North Star. I think the North Star you know, until I get on podcasts like these, I really kind of forget that I had all the business exits because that really was never the goal, right? Like I'm never sitting there going like, okay, 90, 91, 92. Like I kind of forget because in the end, that's just a part of the process that's leading me towards my end purpose. And so the purpose is driving all the activity, not the success. I think people look at it and they go, man, Eddie must be a deal junkie because he's bought and sold all these companies. I might be, but in the end, it's like, it really comes down to, I've got this massive purpose that's driving me. And I think that's what creates the resilience. The mission is just the activities and the achievements along the way. They're just milestones. Achievements are just milestones. And I'll celebrate them and celebrate them with those that help me get there. But in the end, it's like, there's a purpose that's to this. And I think the purpose is actually what causes resilience. So whether you're low or you're high, as long as the purpose, there's this North Star, then ultimately it's like I can stay resilient in any phase of life.
Whoa. And what's your purpose?
My purpose is something that is constantly being defined. And this is the question I get all the time. I'm in my 40s, mid 40s, and I get asked this question all the time because I'll stand on the stage and I talk about impact others and impacting people's life. And they'll be like, you seem like you found your purpose. How do I find mine? And I think in life there's purpose and then there's greater purpose. My purpose today is to be a good dad, to be a good employer. Like there's all these like fundamental purposes, right? That are like the base layer. And I think to the degree that you anchor into, to me, the reason I called my entire nonprofit organization Impact Others is because I realized like my purpose is actually in impacting other people's lives, but it starts with those closest to me. I need to make sure that I'm a good dad, right? Like I need to make sure that I'm good to my family and those around me. I need to be a good employer, right? Like I don't want to build my company on the backs of people. I want to build them with people. I want them at the top with me when we get there. And then it finally came to me one day. We were in Honduras and I was at a college buddy's orphanage that he had built there. I was down there on vacation. And I saw this massive need. He could only feed half the children that were there. And he had to choose some to feed and some not to feed. And I watched the ones that he couldn't feed fight over scraps with dogs. And it's like, it just broke my heart. And as an American, you think like, oh, I can solve this, like we'll fix this. And I get in a car to go buy some rice and chicken and stuff to bring the food back. And he was like, Eddie, he said, let me just tell you something right now. He said, if this is just to appease your conscience, he said, they'll still be starving tomorrow and I still can't feed them tomorrow. Like this is he was like, don't go back with food today unless you can go back with food for a lifetime. And it was a watershed moment for me because I was like, okay, I can make that commitment. It's not that the expense is minimal. And then it was like, once I started and it was like more about like, okay, I can impact those people's lives. And then it was like, whose lives could I impact? And then it really got to this place where it's like, now as I begin to articulate my purpose, even on that greater level, it's really to impact the lives of those that I come in contact with that have no hope if I didn't exist and choose to impact them, right? So that's why we've always gone to kind of the least of these. We have orphanages, feeding centers, we do a lot of clean water projects, and then I've been building sustainable businesses around the world. So I've been building these really crazy ecosystems. And so impacting the lives around me is really my purpose. And I feel like there's a base layer, which is like, I really don't have the right to go feed orphans if I'm not a good employer, right? But as I kind of climbed that purpose ladder, it's like it's all began to illuminate in front of me. Now, will my horizons expand and the people that I impact be greater or maybe more diverse in 10 years? Maybe, so I hate to say there's like this, but the North Star is making sure that I'm gauging my success by how many lives am I impacting.
It was interesting as I was doing a bit of research into your story, that work, Impact Others. I've got a bit of a background in that too. We do quite a bit of work in Southern India and different places around the world, and work in water and work in small business. And it's interesting the life lessons that you get from that. You certainly can't solve all the challenges that have been there for a long, long time. And to try to put yourself in a seat where you think you can is pretty humbling pretty quickly. But to listen and learn and try to be a point of leverage for others, or a point of leadership for others, or I found that pretty grounding when I was learning about your work. I thought, it just struck me. And then I heard you say something that I hadn't heard before. You said financial gain ultimately just reveals who we truly are. Can you tell me a bit more about like how you discovered that?
Yeah, I grew up in a very faith-based household, and I heard this kind of common language, like that money's the root of all evil, and really, the context of that is actually like the love of money is the root of all evil. But what was fascinating to me was as I made my first money, I made poor choices with it, and then I started thinking about what am I doing with this money? I felt so blessed with it. I felt blessed with exits I had and things like that. And it was like a conscious, subconscious moment, right? Like, and then my conscience kicked in, and it was like, even blessed, like, what are you doing with this? And what I realized is like money, resources of any kind. I mean, money specifically, but really resources really become the greatest revealer of actually what's inside. Most people, they get to speak from their audible voice. Some people get a megaphone and a microphone. And I feel like the money and resources we get it's an amplification system of who we really are. And I remember having a real deep thought when I was making my first good money, thinking, who do I want to be? Like, who is Eddie Wilson? Like, it was very much an introspective moment where I decided and made a choice. Like, Eddie's going to use this not for greed or self. Like, yes, I can live a good life. I can up my standard of living, but in the end, it's like, I want to make sure that this doesn't just serve me, And so, I think that money is the ultimate revealer, and I think that as you see people, they're obtaining this money with greed, you just find more greed. They take advantage of more people. It's like people that have for instance, it's like you take somebody like Elon Musk. Elon's goals is he wants to change how we navigate not just our globe but the entire planetary system. And the more money he makes, the more it reveals his real desire, which is like to really change how we navigate everything, and it's like from cars to rockets to trains and it's like it really just kind of reveals who Elon was. Well, if Elon was sitting there broke, like he might have all these dreams and aspirations, but Elon wealthy is like showing that's really who he is.
I'm interested to dig into the business part. I'm curious about like how you've done what you've done, but even before we get into business, because I think this idea of like who you already are is already there. And so many of our viewers are those who are in the grind. I mean, they're looking for that reason to go do it again tomorrow because they've been working hard to this point, and whether it's worked or not, the next step is to do it again, maybe a bit differently, maybe with new lessons, but to keep going. And so what's your thoughts or what's your advice for those, regardless of if they're going to start a business or whatever they're going to go do, but just need to get up and go do it again and need to find a way into the future, maybe differently than they have before?
It's a tough question, because one of the hardest things to do is to break kind of the habitual patterns that put us into where we are. I think one of the greatest lessons I've learned is to really understand who I am, not in kind of my conscious self, but trying to understand who I am in my subconscious self. It's like it's said that, in our conscious brain, we're making 7 decisions a minute, but in our subconscious brain, it's 10,000 or 20,000. It's like we're making all these decisions based on our subconscious mind, the thing that we're unaware of. And typically our subconscious is tied to traumas, it's tied to fears, it's tied to all these things. And I think that if we're not getting the outcome we want, I think we have to stop looking at the activity of our day, and we have to look at the activity of our life, right? Like there are patterns in our life, and sometimes you just really need an honest friend. Like what I've often said to everyone that I asked similar questions to is like, what you really need is one honest friend that's going to tell you like it is, and you're going to break down barriers, and you're going to, because we can only be as emotionally intelligent as the information we're given or can perceive. And sometimes you just need that honest friend or mentor that's going to say, okay, let me show you this pattern that maybe you don't see. Because it's in the breaking of those patterns that we actually get the success we want. That's number one. Really, number two is that oftentimes the things you chase elude you. And so if you chase the right thing, you ultimately get what you ultimately want. I wrote a book a few years ago called Time, Wealth, and Purpose. I didn't start with purpose. I actually started with time, because most oftentimes what you ultimately want is a result of actually just managing your time properly, right? I've always believed that if time is my most valuable asset, I should spend more time managing my time than managing my money, right? Like I should have a really good relationship with my calendar and making sure that I'm putting and getting out of my day everything that I actually want, desire, need, and be relentless with your calendar and your time. For me, the principle of getting what I want out of my life is a time-based principle, not a wealth-based principle. If you chase wealth, it eludes you. If you chase time, wealth oftentimes is the byproduct of it. Exchanging your time for the things that matter most and are the most valuable to you often brings the wealth that you ultimately want. So I rarely look at my world as the wealth or the achievement or the goals, but I look at my world as in these like these pieces of micro time that I will exchange for something that I want something in return for. And that would be the second thing I would say to a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of business people that are pursuing, maybe they're in a W-2 job, and it's like, in the end, it's so important that you manage your time. And I know that's cliche, but I will tell you that to the degree that I manage my time, everything else comes into purview.
Where do you think that real bond to time came to for you? I mean, earlier you mentioned two pretty significant traumas early in your life, and I don't want to ask you down a path that maybe not be comfortable, but I don't know how that shaped you. How did time become so important for you, and did trauma lead to that?
I think trauma definitely did. I lost my sister at a young age. I lost my brother when I was older. I think that time is such a finite construct that we all understand. We all know that we only have so much. But I'll tell you again, it goes back to a great dad who taught me a lot of great lessons. My dad rarely would say to me, Eddie, how much is that? He would say, how much time? So for instance, like the very first time I ever bought a car, I went to my dad and said, hey, I'm going to buy this car. It's $1,800. I'm 16 years old. It's not a nice car. It was just wheels. It got me around. And he said, well, how much is it? And I said, it's $1,800. He said, no, like how much is it? And I was like, and I knew what he meant was I made $4 an hour. I only would get 20 hours a week. What he was asking me is how many weeks of your life, how many days of your life do you have to give away to exchange for this car? And my dad always put in context the cost of things based on time. My poor kids, my three boys get the exact same lesson all the time, and you just can't help it. But I go through an exercise every year now where I actually toggle. I use an app called Toggle where I toggle a lot of my times. Right, like running in the back right now, there's a toggle running. It says I'm on a show with you, and I at the end of the year I give that to my CFO, and we look at my active income based on the time I exchanged. Because I don't know, like at some point, like another dollar, another car, another house doesn't really matter to me. Like I'm more about like the impact I'm making on people's lives, and so I really like lose track of like money because I'm so focused on time. And at the end of the year, we go through an exercise, and Dave, my CFO, tells me like, this is what every minute of your life was worth last year. This is what you exchanged it for. And for me, then I'm constantly dialing that in every single year. I know it's a little crazy, but it's like for me, what it does is it gets me into this place where I'm really hyper focused on what I exchange my time for.
Whoa. I mean, I've never heard it dialed into that degree. I mean, the concept of time, and would 100% subscribe to that idea of like managing your calendar. This thing that we think is like, entry level admin is actually one of the greatest skills that we can possibly have. But to do it to the level that you are, because one of the questions I had coming in was just, how have you done this in business? You're in your mid 40s, as you say, this number of businesses to own, to manage, to exit, the system behind that must be pretty extraordinary. I don't even know where to start at this, but how are you doing what you're doing in business?
Yeah, that's the one question I get asked more than anything. Is like, how do you run all these companies at the same time? And I built a system called Empire. It's called the Empire Operating System. I built it as a greasy wrench on how I could just like systemize my business world. It's become a product, and there's over, I think, 3,000 companies globally that run on this system now. But for me, it wasn't, I never tried to productize it. It was like, how do I get into the rhythm of running these businesses, and how do I add an additional one? How do I get them into this process? So this thing called Empire Operating System, and really the fundamentals of it is that there are really 5 phases to business. There's what we call the startup phase. Then we move into perseverance. That's like pre-profit. It's when we're still wearing lots of hats and there's not enough people. We get into viability. That's phase 3. That's when we actually like look at the business and it's ready for growth. Then scale, and then lastly succession. I have a systematic way of pushing the businesses through every phase with complete intention. And that's the problem with most small business owners. Like, you got a guy that he's running a small tech company or a dry cleaner or whatever it is. They will get into what we call perseverance mode, where they're making a little bit of money. And perseverance is like, you might be profitable 1 month, you might not be profitable the next month. You might be profitable for 6 months, and then you might not be, right? And you don't have the right people in the right seats. You don't have the right systems. There's no way to scale it. But what they do is they go, okay, they start taking all their revenue and they start putting it into areas that really shouldn't be invested in until they're truly viable. And they misstep because they don't know the sequencing. What I've realized is there's a sequencing to growing businesses, and it really doesn't matter what the business is. There's a sequencing to it, and if I can actually grow the business properly, hire the right people, create the right governance layers, understand the right KPIs, right, at the right time, then I can systematically get it through that process faster than just about anyone else. I've mastered that, and that's how we grow and run and scale and potentially exit all the businesses.
Wow. Just as a business owner, I can see my life as you're describing some of those different stages and recognize A, some mistakes, and B, probably some smart moves we've made, somewhere in that journey. So, I mean, obviously you've now got this system that's, a bit of a product that other businesses can operate by. And so maybe you've got I'm not sure if you've got a bias towards it or not, but did you find that building that system for yourself was so important to actually doing it? Or do you find that if if somebody's got a tool out there that works, trust the tool, like don't spend the time trying to figure it out yourself?
Yeah. The first 30 businesses I own, I ran on another operating system. And I was just of the belief that if there's something on the shelf that I could buy that services 90% of my need, I'm just going to spend my time doing the work, not building the system. I got to the place where that system didn't serve me anymore. And mainly because of this, I had businesses, I had 32 companies, I forget what it was at that time when I actually started the Empire Operating System, that had all different phases of business. So I had ones that I was just starting, ones that were in scale, ones that I was potentially going to exit. And the language of the operating system only really helped me with perseverance to viability. How do I get out of this like pre-profit into like stability, right? But it never told me how to scale a business. And so I'd like go learn some other system, and I ended up becoming a green belt in Six Sigma. And it's like, I was just trying to master it all. And I was like, okay, hold on a second. Like, I've got all these products and systems and there's no alignment to them. So yeah, I have a little bit of a bias to what we've built only because it's what's given me my success. It was like, I got stuck and then I was like, okay. And I think that's why we actually have had so much success with the Empire Operating System. I actually never built it to sell it as a product. I built it to solve my problem. And so now there's an operating system out there that's built by a person who has built, grown, scaled, hundreds of companies. And it's like, and so it was built not because I wanted to sell a product. It was built because I had a problem, and I had a universal problem. And at the same time, I was building tech companies and mortgage companies and insurance companies. And I had a building company, and I was managing multifamily units. And it's like, so I had to make it so universal that I could run all of them simultaneously. That was the blessing. The true blessing, though, was during COVID. I had sold, in 2019, I had sold 76 of the companies. So I went from 6,000 employees down to 40 right before COVID. Just to talk about a stroke of luck, And then I had a bunch of operators that were staying with me for the potential next opportunities. And they said, what if, because it wasn't really formalized, they're like, we got our Empire system. What if we, during this time where we can't really travel, go buy companies, what if we just formalize this in preparation for what we're going to do next? It's perfect. That's great use of all of our time. So we all kind of got together and built the Empire operating system as it is today, which is the formal side. But it wasn't even to build it as a product to sell. It was to build it in a way that became very usable for me in my next phase. I really, it's the craziest thing. Life is such a funny thing, but I really thought I was going to build this Empire operating system. I was going to build, grow, scale a bunch of businesses. We're going to do a bunch of philanthropic work. And I was going to hand this book to my son one day and say, this is how your dad built the empire, right? Like that's what I thought was going to happen. And then I ended up investing in a small consulting firm who was trying to solve business problems. And he said one day, would you mind just going with me to this big company? You built one very similar to this. And I was sitting down and I kept saying, well, in my Empire operating system, in my Empire system, my Empire. And then the one guy, he looks across the table, he's got this big firm up in Iowa. And he's like, big civil construction firm. He said, what is this Empire operating system? And I'm like, oh yeah, I guess, well, it doesn't actually exist. It's just what I built for my own company. It's like, and it just kind of dawned me like, okay, it's probably time to take it to market.
Yeah. Because I think about that because, in the space that we're in, we call it motivational media. But the problem that we help people with is oftentimes the success before the success or the moment before the moment. Like we're the help that is getting you off the couch before you go for the run or you're down 2-0 in a football or in a hockey game and you gotta find a way through that. And so we don't have prescribed answers for people. We've got a movement for them or a way to get off the couch or do something different that then they need to go find their system or they need to go invent it or they need to. And so I'm always fascinated by that. Where do we guide them to the tools that are out there or the tools that are within? Or is that conversation in itself enough for people that they recognize it can happen both ways? You got it, go for it.
I love that concept and I speak to it all the time. I actually think what you do is where about 80 to 85% of the work is done. I think the operational system is a layer that goes into a place that's already motivated and kind of cultivated and ready. I tell we got business coaches that are out coaching Empire all the time, and I always tell them, look, if you get to a place where the founder has these issues, we have to solve the leadership issue. We have to solve their issue first because we can overlay the system on top of it, but if they're not ready for it, then it's really not going to help them. Like I can give the most amazing system to the most broken leader, and it's still not going to work. And so I think the work that you do is probably 85% of it. And then I think layering this on top of it is where then the real magic happens.
And, with the Aspirator Tour, I mean, you're working alongside, you're sharing the stage with those who are doing extraordinary things. And, oftentimes the messaging, because I know the messaging of some of those who are on your stage does feel like it's got a bit of a motivational angle to it that then leads to this layer that you're talking about. But it's like, okay, let's get this stuff sorted first. What are you learning? I mean, you were successful when you started it. You're successful now. You're meeting with other successful people. But what are you learning from them that's surprising you? Let's start with those on the stage, actually.
What I'm learning is that most of them have a commonality that they don't often share. Because most of them are behind their brand. There's a wall that's been created for them, one of my favorites is Kevin O'Leary. He's on Shark Tank. They call him Mr. Wonderful. He's this gruff, grouchy, mean guy, right? Like it's his persona. And then you get behind the scenes with him, and we're talking about life and his passion for whatever it is, like watches, cars, like people. And what I notice is that there's something in common with all of them, and it's they've got kind of what I would call like the seeker mentality. They have this passion for life, and they're all going deep in certain areas, and it's all really random stuff. But most of them have like this personality that's like they go really deep in areas, and they're seeking and they're searching and they're always learning, and they don't treat people as if they know it all, right? Like the most successful people we have on the stage, the Mark Cubans. I mean, Mark's multi-billionaire, just exited the Mavericks, made another billion. And it's like, the guy is super, super successful. We were sitting backstage, and he was watching somebody else on the TV in the green room. We got it publicized back there, and we're just chatting. He's like, hold on a second. And he's like listening to the speaker, and he's like, wow, that was really good. Hold on a second. He pulls out his phone. He's like taking a note, right? It's like, he was acting just like me, like that. I was like, and I'm always just so enamored by that in people. And so I think that sometimes their brands kind of position them as like they've found it all. They found all the success. You can't help them. You can't interact with them. And the funny thing is behind the scenes, they're all students of the game. They're all seeking. They're all learning. They're all passionate. That's what I've learned a lot, is that it's okay, and it doesn't diminish who you are. That authenticity of always being okay with not knowing something and being passionate to learn and to grow inside of something, that it doesn't diminish your brand by showing that you don't know something or that you still haven't achieved something in your life. It actually, it's a blessing at that level, because they have access to the people that can help them achieve it even quicker,
Yeah, no, it's interesting, that kind of zest for life component, and how that, finds a way, whether it's, thing A or thing B, oftentimes random, but it shows up somehow. And the reason why I was asking, it just popped in my head because it's this line. It was the first interview we ever did with the show. It was with Chris Bosh, who was a Hall of Fame NBA player. And I asked him about playing with Kobe. I just said, like, what did you learn from playing with Kobe? And I'm expecting the system. I'm expecting the 4 a.m., 1,000 shots. And what he said was, I learned how to get up off the mat. And I was like, really? Like that's what you learned from one of the greatest players of all time? And it's grounding sometimes to think about like what the observation or what the thing is that really does strike you in a way that says, now I can do different, or I know different, or I can see this differently. And for those who only get to meet some of these people through a screen or through they sit in the audience and hear somebody from a stage, it's interesting to ask those who are having conversations backstage with them, just to say like, what's really striking you? And so that zest for life sounds pretty compelling.
It's something that we can all learn from too, right? It's like, I think it's just, it's empowering when you realize like they still haven't arrived yet either. They're still seeking and searching. We're all on the same journey together. There's a camaraderie in it.
What are you learning from those who are in the audience?
I'm learning from those in the audience that it's been a crazy journey. I was always the person who just stood in the background. I built my career on pushing big brands and sitting in the background. And 2 years ago, Andrew, my business partner, and I, we went down and we spent a day or so with Grant Cardone in South Florida, and just were hanging out. And we're just curious how he had built what he had built. And I always looked at Grant and I was like, he's the guy that's taking a selfie with his jet and his Rolls Royce and all this stuff. And it's like, that's not me. And I just felt like there's this massive separation between us. And Grant was like, so you've had the $1 billion exit? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, why don't I know about that? And I said, well, you do, you know me. He said, no, I mean, like, I can't find anything on it. And I was like, okay, I don't really want you to, and he was like, that everything you want is on the other side of exposure. And I said, no, that's not true. Everything I don't want is on the other side of exposure, and he said, do you need more money? I said, well, maybe for more philanthropic things, sure. He goes, well, if you had more exposure, more money would come to you. He was like, do you need greater employees, better employees? I said, well, yeah, certainly, everybody does. He was like, I don't recruit. They all come to me. He said, they beg me for jobs. And he started like going down this path. And I was like, man, he has me here. Like, I've always resisted building the personal brand. So 2 years ago, I started the process of building the personal brand very reluctantly, very resisting of it. And then started standing on my own stage, just telling my story. This is how I found the success, being very vulnerable just next to the celebrities. And what I realized is, and then I go out in the crowd and I spend a ton of time with the people. And it's funny because they see the stage as like a separation, right? Like the person who's on the stage must be different than me. And what's interesting is the fellowship and all of the things that have come out of it was never intentional. But what I realized is like they're really not going to be Kevin Hart. Like, yeah, Kevin Hart's on the stage and they all think he's the greatest thing ever. But they're sitting there watching and they're like, I can't be Kevin Hart. Like, I'm not going to have Kevin Hart's career. I'm not going to have his success. But then they see me on the stage, and I think sometimes they think, oh, but maybe I could be him, right? Like, he's the guy between me and Kevin, right? Like, he's not Kevin. He doesn't have this massive, crazy brand. He's not in all these movies. And then I'm accessible, right? Like, I'm out in the crowd taking selfies and answering questions and just having a good time and spending time trying to learn. What I realize is like that from the crowd, what everyone really, really wants is they want access to the next level. And we just never get it. Like what I would have killed for in my early career was for somebody to walk me into a business that was, if I was at 5 million, they were at 10 million. They would have walked me in and just said, like, let me show you what I do to get to 10, and it's like, we all just need that person that's one step ahead of us, and realizing that I could be that is a place in my life that I could actually spend my time, find fulfillment in, give back, has been a really great lesson for me, because I always felt like I always kind of cast my value aside, because I think, oh, I mean, Mark Cuban's on my stage. That's Mark Cuban, and I would like to be like Mark Cuban, it's like, and then you like kind of cast your value aside and you think, well, all these people just need Mark Cuban, and you realize like, no, they don't. Like Mark Cuban is so unattainable for them. What they really want is Eddie Wilson, or they really want Andrew Cordell, or they want some of these other people that are on the stage, and realizing that like, all of us have value in this chain, like, and if you can turn around and reach back to the person beneath you and pull them up as you begin to ascend the ladder, kind of life's journey, there's real fulfillment in that, like there's massive fulfillment in that. And to me, it's been very, very gratifying to be able to be a chain in that, link in that chain.
I could feel myself responding as you were talking about that idea of like everything you want on the other side of that exposure. I mean, I wrestle, I think a lot of people wrestle with this. I wrestle with this personally, even with this show. Like, I don't know if I want what's on the other side of that exposure. I actually don't. Like, I grew up pretty shy. That's still who I am. I'm not seeking that personally. But then what is drawing me towards having these conversations? And if you get stuck in the fear of it, I think it's easy just to not pursue it. But then if you start to kind of push forward a little bit and recognize that, this really isn't that much about me. This is about everyone else who is going to be part of this journey with us and learning and thinking and exploring their own life and dealing with fears. And that line you had right at the start where you learned to almost right size fears or figure out like, what should I actually be scared of versus not? So I think fear is just, it's so close to us in so many ways. And so many people are stuck with that right now. I know you kind of have that logical versus emotional approach, but how do you actually deal with fear?
I think that number one, it goes to identifying that it exists in my life. And to me, every action in life, it's said there's two great emotions. There's fear-based activity, and there's love-based activity. We're either running from something or running to something. Anytime that I'm in this like position of avoidance or running from something, 9 times out of 10, it's a fear-based activity. So what I'm doing is I'm constantly looking at my motives and my actions, determining like, am I passionately pursuing something because that's a love-based activity, or am I actually avoiding something? I don't want the liability. I don't want whatever it is. And then identifying and then go, okay, that's fear. And then let's actually like reason through that, like, And then it goes back to what should we be afraid of? Like, there are really only a few things in life that we should be afraid of, and most of it, actually, the things that we're afraid of and we imagine in our mind, actually, if we went through them, would better us, right? Like, it might be painful, but it's about having a decent relationship with her. But I think you have to understand what you do in your daily activities, and it's being conscious enough to look at what you do and determine: am I avoiding something? Or am I running to something? That's where purpose and mission and all this stuff anchors into it. Because if I can kind of stay rooted in purpose, impacting someone else's life, impacting the lives of those that can't impact themselves, it's like it's a lot easier to kind of like root that fear-based activity out of my life.
What would you say has been the lesson that's taken you the longest to learn?
I think being super vulnerable is that the lessons I think I've taken the longest to learn, I'm still learning, still had a conversation with a coworker yesterday about it, was that most oftentimes the hurts that come into my life, the people that reject you, the people that leave you, the people that give you a hard time, really has very little to do with you. Oftentimes it has to do everything with them, right? Like, you could have the greatest motive with the greatest intent, and it doesn't always cause the greatest reaction. And that oftentimes those reactions have little to do with you. Like, to me, I'm so conscious of the reaction of someone else in a very logical way, but not necessarily, it doesn't like flare me up emotionally, but it's like a logical way. Like, oh, I don't like that, I want to change that. And realizing that there's oftentimes very little I can do to change that reaction. Most of the hurts that people go through in life have very little to do with the fact that they're broken. Oftentimes it's the person who is actually hurting that's the broken person. It's something that's going on in their life that's caused that reaction. That's a hard lesson to learn, because we look at it and it's like, ooh, why did you do that to me? That really, really hurt. Or why did you choose to go somewhere else and work with somebody else or do something else? And it's like, and that's a tough one. But I think I'm still learning that one, because I like to, when you're predisposed to just fixing problems, right? A logical person just wants to dive into a problem and fix it. And that's what I want to do. I love fixing problems. Some problems just can't be fixed because you're not in control of it.
How do you, in that idea, be honest with yourself where it is something that you need to work on versus them? Like, how do you tell the difference? Because I think that, the flip side to that is just saying it's everyone else's issue. So how do you find that honest moment with yourself too?
I think that you have to check every motive. And I think that when you see that reaction, the first look should be introspective, right? Like, I think any problem you go through, we should definitely dissect down our own, issues first. Like, before you cast the, like, oh, that's just them. I think that it takes some introspection. It takes like this like idea of like, okay, did I do anything to cause that? What was my motive? What was my intent? Sometimes, I often say to my coworkers and those that work with me, it's like, sometimes it's not your position that's causing the problem, it's your disposition. It's like how you did it, not like what you did. And it's making sure that I'm checking not just my position, like, was I right? It was like, but how did I go about it? I think are all very, very important conversations to have internally. And then if your motives are right, feel like you did your best, and there's still a reaction, I think oftentimes we've got to just kind of write it off and move on and realize that, the only thing I can control is me.
Yeah. And liberate yourself from it. Because I think we can shoulder a lot of stuff that's not our stuff. And that doesn't take away from the stuff that is our stuff, but they're just two different things. Yeah. What advice would you give a 20-year-old nowadays?
I have that conversation a lot because I have a 22-year-old son. And so sometimes you feel like you're looking at yourself in the mirror, giving yourself advice as a 20-year-old again. And oftentimes the advice I would give myself is really two things. And it goes back to what we just talked about. Control the things you can control. Worry and fear and all those things typically are rooted in trying to control something that's not yours to control. You can't control success. You can't control pain, how much pain you're going to go through in life, starting a business, the job you're in, raising children. There are things you just can't control. The two things I can control in my life are fear, how much I'm going to give to it, because I can usually counterbalance fear with knowledge. And secondly, how long I'm going to stay under the weight of the problem, perseverance. I can typically choose how long I'm going to stay under the problem and persevere, and how much fear I'm going to have in it. I can't control pain, and I can't control success. So it's really control the things I can control. And the second thing is, it goes back to that time concept. Stop worrying about the money you believe you need in order to fulfill your dreams, and start architecting the dreams and the success you want in a time quotient that will get you there. Take money off the table. Start thinking about how to manage your time to get to the success you want, and start controlling that time to get there, and then let money and wealth and resources all take care of itself. Resources, and this is a really important principle, resources are always in the hands of the diligent, right? Who are the diligent? The diligent are the people who control their time, right? So that's the advice I'd give to it.
There's a lot of layers in that. I think that struck a lot of people, and there's probably quite a bit to unpack as they think through that. I mentioned at the start, you've owned over 100 businesses, you've exited 90 plus businesses, you've built this Aspirator Tour, you're doing not-for-profit work around the world. Like, it's a lot that's happened already. What do you see coming next?
I'm super excited for what's next, because to me, I feel like the foundation has been built, and I get to just exercise everything on top of the foundation. To me, we're going to take the 4,000 children we feed every single day and educate every single day to 10,000, right? Like, we're freeing slaves in Pakistan right now, literally paying for their freedom, teaching them to build businesses. I don't want to free, one brick factory has over 700 enslaved people. I'm trying to buy the brick factory right now because I want to free 700 families. To me, it's just like, it's an exponential, opportunity on what's already been built. And that's what I'm really, really excited about, is just to make sure that my time is being allocated towards the growth of all of those things that I get so much fulfillment in. Yeah, this past year, my business partner, Dan Fleischman, actually asked me to take a year and answer every DM that comes through my social media platforms. So on all the social platforms, Eddie Wilson Official, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, all the above, I actually interact. And so I'd love to get any interaction, answer any question. Maybe you have a business question, I'd love to interact and really communicate back through social.
Eddie, it was cool learning about your story coming into this conversation. I was fascinated by the operating system, but also been really fantastic to learn about the foundation that's underneath that. Really appreciate your time today. We're cheering you on. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for letting me be on the show.